This is a production of the Greater West Bloomfield Historical Society and Civic Center TV. In 1818, explorers made their way into what is today Oakland County, leading the way for communities like ours in Greater West Bloomfield to be born. In partnership with the West Bloomfield Township Public Library, John Marshall presented the history behind this expedition.
Well, Helen Jane, you took about 10 minutes out of my 15-minute introduction, but other than that, we're fine. I did get a call from Helen Jane in July of 2016. She called me with three questions. One was, could I help her find the four corners that she talked about? And did I know anything about these guys that came out from Detroit in 1818 and found Sylvan Lake for her? And oh, by the way, did I know how to digitize all the stuff from the Daniel Whitfield School? Well, we solved the first two, but I don't think we solved the Daniel Whitfield School archives yet. But in any event, my recollection is about the same as Helen Jane's, but not exactly. This was one of the quotes that she saw that led her to ask the question, what about this 1818 expedition? Did I know anything about it? I remembered one thing only that I had read many years before this, probably back in 2002 or 3, in the Royal Oak Public Library when I went there to look for material on something else I was researching. And I was just thumbing through some of their books, and they had something called Twigs and Acorns, a book, a bunch of, just a potpourri of little one-pagers, two-pagers, descriptions of things about Royal Oak. And in there was a description of an event that took place in 1931, that the Ferndale Library, which was 1 year old at the time, had collaborated with the Detroit Historical Society to commemorate this 1818 group expedition out of Detroit that Helen Jane was curious about. And what they did, and this is part of that write-up, what they did is they they produced a booklet, which I'll show you in a minute, and then they had 150 automobiles about, like in a big funeral procession, driving through a route that approximated what these explorers would have gone through, or these businessmen. They aren't really explorers, but that led, this fact that I found this one little two-page thing and told Helen Jane about it, then she grabbed hold of it like she usually does with things, and she found, I'm going to find more from Ferndale. So she called Ferndale Library up. They did this back when they were only 1 year old, back in 1931. They knew nothing about this event that they had, except they did go look through their archives, and they found a booklet that they had produced on their first anniversary for this event that they shared with the Detroit Historical Society. And that booklet was great in several ways. It had a map of what the cars followed this route in 1931 through the route that approximated the route that the explorers went on their horseback and on foot. They had marked off 10 points of interest. Some of them are the Royal Oak in tree. There's a plaque in the middle of Royal Oak for that. They marked out a spot called on 13 Mile in Greenfield that was described in the expedition. They marked out a spot on looking out over Orchard Lake at Apple Island. And so they had people stationed at these 10 located Boy Scouts. Now I don't know how they did that with the cars all cruising along in a conga line through the thing, but anyway, they said they had Boy Scouts at these sites. Once we found that, we kept looking and did some stuff with Google searches and such, and came up with another publication in 1959 that was written by the Michigan alumnus called their Quarterly Review. And in there, somebody had written an article, this guy, Bidlock, written an article about a narration that Judge Woodward had written about this expedition. It was a tongue-in-cheek Saturday Night Live type of a thing of the expedition. Although when the guy wrote his report on it for this Michigan Alumnus magazine, he did quote some things from it that led us to look for more stuff. He quoted a newspaper article from the Detroit Gazette of of 1818, what was it, November 13th or something, 1818. And he also quoted a diary of a guy named Reverend John Monteith. So that led Helen Jane and I and others to look for those things. But first of all, in this article written in 1959, there was another map, a little bit better when you studied it, a little bit better than the map that the Ferndale folks had, a little more accurate about the path that was taken by the expedition. But we did find the Detroit Gazette, which was a newspaper written in the early days of Detroit, started about 1817. This was an 1818 version, 13th of November, 1818. You'll hear more about it in this recording that I'm going to be playing for you. Helen Jane also found in the library in Ann Arbor, Bentley Library in Ann Arbor, the diary of Reverend John Monteith. John Monteith was a Presbyterian minister. We'll call him a missionary. He was sent out from the east to come to Detroit, rough old Detroit, and where all the Catholics were, and bring Protestantism to Detroit. He would set up a Sunday school and stuff, but that's my version of it. But he was a Presbyterian minister, and he wrote some things, and we'll hear his diary quoted completely in the area that he talks about this trip. The group had at their disposal maps that were drawn in 1817, the year before, by the surveyors who surveyed the townships, Bloomfield, West Bloomfield, Waterford, and so forth. They had maps that they could take from the land office, and they used this to find their way around. That's why they could be so accurate in their descriptions in that Gazette article about what lake they were and how big around it was and where they went from that lake to this lake and what section it was in and so forth. So you'll hear more about that in the presentation. But they had maps. They weren't just going out blind, but they were the first people to actually go out and use the maps to look around and see if what the surveyor mentioned was really accurate. We gathered up this material, and as Helen Jane said, we had a lot of people working on this project once we decided to do a project. Sue Williams worked on it with us, Helen Jane worked on it, Gina worked on it with us. We had folks from the Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society involved. My head of my historical society, Pam Carmichael, worked on it. Her husband, Michael, did a lot of the work with the script of what you'll see. Actually, Neil Hepburn's not here today, is he? Neil used to be one of your society members, and he wrote the original draft script for the presentation that you'll see. And then Michael Carmichael finished it up, put the slides in, and so forth. But Neil did a really good job of giving us an initial draft to work with. But we didn't know what to do. First, we thought, somebody said, take a bus tour, set up 150 cars, have a narrated bus tour, travel the route, and talk about it. Well, I did it in my car once, and it didn't look all that interesting. A 60-mile drive and all this modern strip malls and things around, it didn't really strike me as being that impressive. Others said, well, make a driving map, because some people can take and follow their own, on their own, or we should have a little recording that they can play while they do it. Others said, make a Ken Burns style video with all everything you could. Well, others said PowerPoint presentation. Well, we have a combination video and PowerPoint type presentation, which I'll show you. When this is over, I have a little handout that you might find interesting. I don't know I have enough for everybody to take one. If there are couples here, take one to share it. Helen Jane had them stuck somewhere. You can put in the back, Helen Jane. It has a map in the middle, a fold-out, a centerfold map of the route. And it has a page from the Gazette, introduction to the article from the Detroit Gazette, and the last page showing the signatures of the 5 guys, if you will, that wrote actually are claimed to have written the article. So you'll hear a lot more about these documents and the details of what they are in the actual presentation. They would say we crossed a Indian path at 6 chains and such from the corner. We found the edge of this swampy area here, and we found this kind of trees and so forth. And he took a produced a by hand work. He took the field notes. If any of you ever surveyors, field notebooks, and he transcribed the information from the field books into section 1, section 2, section 3, all and at all the points at which the posts were set and what they saw when they saw the Indian paths that crossed. So now we have the field notebooks of the surveyors in a map form, which is really very, very wonderful to have. It's a lot easier than reading those cryptic field notes. So we have that. You have one for West Bloomfield, and Helen Jane's in charge of that.
And now, we present a documentary from our friends at the Bloomfield Historical Society and Bloomfield Community Television for more on this historic excursion to our home in Oakland County.
Fall of 1818, a number of leading citizens of Detroit formed an expedition. It would be the first careful, complete, semi-official tour of exploration into what would become Oakland County. The expedition was designed to open the interior of the territory of Michigan for settlement. Although diverse in nature, yet bound by this common interest, these citizens ventured out of their city and into the unknown. This is their story.
Detroit in the 1800s was a small outpost in the Northwest Territory, fronting on the Detroit River. It had been founded by the French more than a century earlier as a fur trading hub. It served the French well, and they remained content with their way of life on the river's edge. A small military garrison occupied a fort to protect citizens from hostile forces. A few miles back from the river, a band of forested swampland created a morass. It surrounded their city and discouraged expansion. Most in Detroit viewed the interior as a vast, unknown wilderness. In June of 1805, a great fire leveled the town. The townsfolk watched helplessly from a distance as their wooden homes burned. Just days later, Congress created the territory of Michigan. As the town was rebuilding, the War of 1812 again brought devastation to Detroit. One account said that the war had prevented any crops from being grown and that supplies of all kinds were extremely scarce. A resident wrote, "The alarming prospect before us you can have no idea of." Once the war ended, all 15 stars on the American flag were flying over Detroit. War heroes and new territorial governor, General Lewis Cass, became focused on developing the potential for the whole territory. Cass knew that the potential required population growth and expansion away from the riverfront and into the interior. Opportunity lay in attracting those thousands of westward pushing immigrants from the east, immigrants who hoped to find good lands for farming and a new future in the west. It was the unknown interior beyond the swamp that held the best prospects, but there was a key obstacle to overcome. Before settlers could locate land to buy, the land would have to be surveyed. The U.S. government had ordered 2 million acres of the middle of the territory to be surveyed and set aside for war veterans. The surveyors of these bounty lands, as they were called, said that the land was swampy and worthless.
Their report went to Surveyor General Edward Tiffin, who sent it along to Washington. Tiffin famously quoted the findings of his surveyors: there would not be more than 1 acre out of 100, if there would be 1 out of 1,000, that would in any case admit to cultivation. That did it. Congress and the administration withdrew the Michigan bounty lands, all 2 million acres of them, and sent them elsewhere. The bounty lands were gone. Thoughts of growing Michigan were diminishing rapidly. Luckily, within the city itself, some positive things were happening. The governor and a small group of men, mainly recently arrived from the east, were providing much-needed leadership. Now no longer French, no longer British, Detroit was becoming an American city. By 1818, there was a new spirit of enterprise and cultural change. 51 buildings were newly erected. Many organizations were formed, including the Bank of Michigan, created to provide a much-needed economic foundation for the area, the Detroit Bible Society. There was also a Protestant Sunday School Association, the Moral and Humane Society, the Library Company of the city, the Agricultural Society, and the Mechanical Society, and an academy called the University of Michigania. We know it now simply as the University of Michigan. And there was the Lyceum. Members met weekly in the old council house to debate the important issues, such as, was Brutus justified in killing Caesar? By the end of summer 1818, crowds gathered along the river to watch as a newfangled steamboat, walk in the water, chugged its way up the river, its 4-pound cannon celebrating its arrival. It was the first of its kind on the Great Lakes. Reports of all these activities appeared in the Detroit Gazette. Founded only the year before at the urging of Governor Cass, the newspaper usually was just 4 pages, 3 in English and part of one still in French. The Gazette was set with mismatched type that appeared to have been discarded by a previous publication. It let its readers know of government actions in Washington and events elsewhere, as well as local news. With all this positive activity, many in Detroit were questioning the reports of the surveyors. There was talk of good land in the interior if you could get past the barrier created by the swamp. Cass pushed Washington for new surveyors. He wrote that the land has been grossly misrepresented. I can speak from my many observations that it is equal to any land I've ever seen. Washington listened and sent new teams of surveyors led by Joseph Wampler and Samuel Carpenter. They divided the interior into saleable townships and sections. The surveyors zigzagged across the region, driving coded stakes every half-mile to mark the boundaries. They made field notes of features such as lakes, rivers, wetlands, and Indian pathways. Also in 1818, the Government Land Office in Detroit opened. It had the surveyors' new township maps. It had their field notes describing the quality of the land. People could use them to locate good land in the interior to buy. But customers from the east weren't going to come buy farmland if they still believed Michigan Territory was a swamp. It was time to resolve the central issue. Was Michigan's interior a swampland? It was the Gazette that knew the plans of a group of leading citizens who were forming an expedition into the interior. And 200 years ago, in late October of 1818, the Gazette teased its readers with this note.
A few days since, a party of our citizens traveled into the interior for the purpose of examining the soil and face of the country. Their account is flattering and is to be hoped, and indeed expected, that they will lay the information they have obtained before the public.
5 members of the expedition, Austin E. Wing, Wayne County Sheriff, Benjamin Stead, tailor and merchant, David C. McKinstry, business promoter, the Reverend Mr. John Monteith, Presbyterian minister, Andrew G. Whitney, prominent lawyer, were prevailed upon to write about what they had seen and share that information with the public. Information that would forever change the course of what would become Oakland County. However, even before the 5 had time to submit their report to the Gazette, one of the party, the Reverend John Monteith, had already confided to his diary the story of the group's first attempt to penetrate the interior, a failed attempt. With wry humor, he tells us,
"Last week I was solicited by a number of the citizens going into the interior to explore the surveyed lands, to accompany them. I objected to going in the middle of the week, but would like to go, if they would defer it till after the Sabbath. They, however, had made their arrangements otherwise and set out on Thursday."
Monteith then related how the group had proceeded a few miles, pitched their tents, leaving one man to guard their camp, and set out in different directions to locate where the surveyors had marked trees and set posts so they could tell where they were.
They did so with the understanding that they would return to their tents before night. However, scarce any of them found their way back.
By Sunday, each had finally managed to locate the Detroit River and follow it rather sheepishly back home. Monteith noted with obvious amusement,
They now found themselves coming directly to my proposals and were all ready to set out on Monday.
the second attempt would be a do-over and not conflict with the Sabbath. In its November 13, 1818 edition, the Detroit Gazette published the results of their second, and this time successful, expedition in a letter to editors Sheldon and Reed. A view of some of the lands in the interior of the territory of Michigan, it began.
An expedition was lately formed, as is known to you and the public, to explore some parts of the interior of this territory. We, the undersigned, who composed that exploring party, having been solicited by many respectable citizens to publish the results of our observations on the lands we have viewed during our excursion, have drawn up the following statement. As reports have been spread abroad unfavorable to the character of the soil, it was a principal object of the party to ascertain by their own observation how far these reports were founded on truth, that we might give satisfactory information to our friends and to immigrants.
Following the Tiffin report, Michigan had been receiving a lot of bad press. Coverage of this positive news would be welcome to potential new settlers and to help dispel the damage done by those earlier surveyors' reports.
It may be a matter of surprise to persons abroad that so little has hitherto been known of this district of country. The fact is owing to several circumstances. The first settlers of the country are remarkable for their partiality to situations on large water, and in no case did they depart from this choice, nor have they any disposition to explore lands otherwise situated.
The first settlers, the French, clung to the Detroit River. They had established what were called ribbon farms, long, narrow strips fronting on the river and then extending back about 1.5 miles or more.
Again, it is remarkable that along the Detroit River, where you leave the waters 1 or 2 miles, you come into lowlands which generally extend about 3 miles in breadth. Such a stripe of land is found in the rear of our city, which has deterred many from going further back and has made a very unfavorable impression respecting the whole country.
For most of the year, the flat land behind the city was virtually a virtual morass, swamp-like and impassable.
The circumstances mentioned together with some others have furnished interested and designing persons with their means of defaming the country and retarding its population, while the truth has been known to few, and still fewer felt any disposition to diffuse it.
Those most likely to know the truth about the interior lands were not inclined to share their knowledge. The French fur traders were perfectly content to keep things as they were. The Native American traders who roamed the countryside, as our explorers explained, seldom paid any attention to its advantages as an abode for civilized people.
And finally, what has rendered it uninteresting to judicious immigrants, its lands have never, till this summer, been exposed for sale. But now that the country offers lands, rights, and privileges to freemen, every friend of American prosperity must have a wish to become acquainted with its natural advantages.
More notes from Monteith's diary give us a picture as the expedition started out.
We left the city at an early hour, and having the necessary information respecting the surveys, we proceeded directly into them.
The information provided by the maps and notes of the most recent government surveyors, Joseph Wampler and Samuel Carpenter, guided the expedition into the interior. An unusually dry October enabled them to follow the Saginaw Trail, a Native American path along a low ridge between the Rouge River and what was once Connors Creek. They left the city, the stripe of low land, and into the dim light of the forest. That's Detroit, that really little rectangle on the riverfront. It sort of puts into perspective how small the city was at the time.
Our course from this place was northwesterly. We passed through 8 miles of land that is but little undulated. The soil is of good quality and everywhere sandy. The timber is sycamore, ash, sugar maple, linn, elm, poplar, ironwood, beech, hickory, and oak, red and white.
Throughout their report to the Gazette, the 5 authors described conditions immigrants would want to know, in effect creating an immigrant's guide. They included the type of trees, the soil, water quality and sources, the availability of stones for building materials, and tell where there are prairies and oak openings. Oak openings were important and something we don't know today. They had widely spaced, sturdy oaks with little or no underbrush. Fires, both natural and started by the Native Americans, cleared out the small saplings of other varieties and left the noble oaks essentially untouched. This was good for Eastern settlers to know, as it meant fewer trees to clear for their first crop. Reverend Monteith continues in his diary with a more personal narrative of events on that first day.
It was, however, cloudy and rained some toward night. We therefore pitched our tents early and kindled good fires. After we had supped and were comfortable, we resolved to form ourselves into a branch of the Detroit Lyceum. We soon became organized and pursued a regular course of discussion. I almost forgot that we were not in the old stone council chamber at Detroit. We found the woods and the open no impediment to eloquence. We had good order and were not wanting in animation. The evening passed off pleasantly, as did the rain, and a good night's repose brought us to the cheering light of a fine morning.
We came into ridges of oak land interspersed with prairies covered thickly with high grass. These prairies arise a branch of the Red Run. At about 10 miles, we crossed a small stream of excellent clear water. The soil is good and will be excellent wheat land. It is thinly timbered with lofty white oak.
As they rode through what we know as Pleasant Ridge on into Royal Oak, the Saginaw Trail took advantage of a natural high ridge that had been formed thousands of years before. It's still there today and known as Ridge Road.
After passing through these lands, about 4 miles further, we came to another small branch of the Red Run, about which there are some fine bottoms. It was in Range 11, East, Township 1, Sections 8, 9, 5, and 4.
They knew exactly where they were because each township the surveyors laid out was 6 miles square, with 36 sections each section containing 640 acres. The corners of the township were indicated by sturdy wood corner posts that bore the notation of its township and range. By comparing their notes with a current map, we can locate the expedition at what is today Woodward Avenue and Normandy in Royal Oak. Nearby Pioneer Park has a plaque that commemorates the explorers.
In Section 6, we encamped and viewed the lands in the neighborhood. Here is another small branch of the Red Run. The banks are elevated, stones sufficiently abundant for ordinary purposes. Upon the whole, it would admit excellent farms.
In the morning, they left the Saginaw Trail and most likely were following one of the smaller Native American paths. It took them to Southfield Township, where they crossed a branch of the Rouge River at about today's 13-mile and Evergreen roads.
The first part of this course was through land for the most part level, well timbered, but near the Rouge the land is more variegated by oak ridges. The river passes through a rich vale about 15 rods wide and has, this dry season, a strong rapid current of pure water.
Perhaps this portion, with its engaging description, was written by Reverend Monteith as soon after the trip he filed a claim for land there, although he never settled on it.
After passing this stream, we changed our course to the north and crossed into ridgy oak land, which exhibited a beautiful appearance. You can see generally the distance of half a mile.
The surveyor's notes couldn't compare with what they saw about them as they rode up a ridge into the higher open lands and hills in southern Bloomfield Township. Its open oak land inspired the name of the county.
We then came to a cluster of lakes, which are the sources of the Rouge and Huron rivers. As we knew of no names that they had hitherto received, we thought it expedient to give them some, and designated most for those we saw by the names of the explorers.
By the names of the explorers. This phrase is the source of history's confusion about who was actually on the expedition. The names they gave to the 12 lakes might well have represented all of the men on the trip and perhaps 2 wives, for these were frontier women after all. But we know for sure only the 5 who signed the Gazette article. Each of them came with separate reasons for taking part in the expedition. Each brought different life experiences to add to the overall observations included in their report. Together they made a significant difference in the way Oakland County was settled. We will explain a bit about them and the others as each lake is named. Continuing on, following a Native American path, they crossed what would become Maple Road, west of Telegraph.
The first, Lake Wing, is in Section 29, Township 2, Range 10, about 3 miles in circumference, the waters exceedingly clear and the banks handsomely elevated.
Was it the luck of the draw that the first lake was named after Austin Eli Wing, or was it because of his age? 26. He was the youngest of the group. Described by contemporaries as possessing talent of the highest order, Wing was a graduate with honors of Williams College. He had accompanied Governor Cass and William Woodbridge after the War of 1812 to Detroit, where he continued in the law office of Woodbridge. He even acquired 320 acres on the shore of his lake, and he would be elected to serve several terms in Congress.
Following another Native American path, they moved on, first to Lake Sibley, with its 1 small island, then to Lake Stead, which they noticed had 2 small islands, and which was separated from Lake McKinstry by a narrow, high peninsula.
The first in this group of lakes was Lake Sibley. Solomon Sibley was one of the earliest lawyers in Detroit. He started his legal career riding the circuit with a group of other attorneys and a judge. With their legal documents and saddlebags, they rode horseback to towns that were not large enough to have a permanent court. He was the first mayor of Detroit and a law partner of Andrew Whitney. Lake Sibley is now Gilbert Lake. The next lake was named for Benjamin Stead. At 40, he was one of the oldest explorers and one of the original stockholders in the Bank of Michigan. English by birth, Stead was a tailor and co-founder with Austin E. Wing of the Protestant Sunday School Association, which was formed to instruct children and others in the art of reading, free of expense. Lake Stead is now Island Lake. The third lake in this group was named for David McKinstry, the oldest of the explorers at 50. One of the most colorful characters in Detroit at that time, he was described by contemporaries as tall and heavily built, rather abrupt in manner and speech, yet of a warm and genial disposition. He was given the nickname Silverheels because of his success in business and real estate. Perhaps, though, his greatest claim to fame would come years later when he opened a museum, a circus, and an early 19th century version of an amusement park called the Michigan Garden and Grand Cosmorama. Lake McKinstry is today's Lower Long Lake.
Southwesterly from the peninsula is Lake Monteith.
We've heard earlier from the Reverend John Monteith, who was described as 6 feet tall and straight as a Michigan pine. Governor Cass had invited this Princeton seminarian to come to Detroit and establish a Presbyterian church. He was the founder and the first president of the University of Michigan. The seed money to build the university's first building came from the Masons of Detroit, and, for that matter, most of Detroit's leadership community were Masons. That's Monteith in the center accepting his gift from fellow Masons. Austin Wing is standing over on the right. Monteith's Lake, later called Black Nut Lake, is today simply called Walnut Lake.
By now, our travelers are in West Bloomfield with its 4,000 acres of lakes, the heart of Oakland County's lake country. The party explores more lakes, which they continue to name.
Half a mile further northwesterly, leaving Lake Canfield to the right, is Lake Macomb, about 9 miles in circumference, embracing an island of about 40 acres, on which are a number of productive apple trees.
Lake Canfield was named for Captain August Canfield, a graduate of West Point and Governor Cass's son-in-law. His lake became Pine Lake. Not surprisingly, the explorers took special note of Lake Macomb, now Orchard Lake. It's equally not surprising they would give this imposing lake, 9 miles in circumference, the name of the decorated war hero Alexander Macomb, Jr. After all, Governor Cass had already named the county to the east for him. Macomb, an engineer, was also involved in building many of the military roads in the area. He would rise to become a commanding general of the U.S. Army.
The 40-acre island they described in the middle of Lake Macomb, steeped in history and legend, was a Native American gathering spot Called Apple Island today, in 2018, school children reintroduced apple trees to continue the tradition.
Westward of Lake Macomb and connected with it is Lake Catherine. The land amongst these lakes is generally similar. The water is pure and the bottom generally gravel, well stored with a variety of fish, and the shores generally elevated and pleasant.
Lake Catherine, closely connected to Macomb's Lake, is named for his wife. Lake Catherine is now known as Upper Straits Lake. They continued on through West Bloomfield.
Crossing the outlet from Lake Macomb to Lake Cass, following an elevated ridge between these two lakes, we passed northwesterly through oak ridges and prairies to Lake McDougal.
George McDougal was an early Detroit lawyer, and he was called the father of the bar by his contemporaries. He had just completed a 2-year term as secretary for the Detroit Board of Trustees and served for years as the adjutant general of the Michigan Territory. His lake is known today as Union Lake.
The group, now heading into Waterford Township, is clearly delighting in the nature of the unexplored country as it opens before them.
Here we changed our course northeasterly and traversed alternating ridges and places of prairies, tamarack swamps, till we struck a river running into Lake Cass. This river we named O'Drain. It passes where we crossed it through an extensive and beautiful meadow, richly clothed in thick high grass. The river is at this place about 20 feet wide and 18 inches deep, as clear as crystal, and passes over a bottom of silicous pebbles with gentle current. From River O'Drain we passed over high ridges of ground and approached Lake Elizabeth. Then, proceeding along the south shore, traversed a tract of excellent, well-timbered land between this lake and Cass Lake.
Governor Lewis Cass is the man most closely associated with early Michigan. His vision created the expedition. Lake Cass, the largest and deepest lake in Oakland County at 1,280 acres and 123 feet deep, rightly honors the governor. If General Macomb and his wife had a pair of lakes, then General Cass and his wife Elizabeth, the First Lady of the Territory, deserved no less.
From Lake Elizabeth, passed in a northeasterly direction over high rolling land, oak ridges and rich bottoms, timber butternut, black walnut, and black birch. We crossed a stream connecting a small lake lying in the same section with Lake Whitney, from the eastern extremity of which issues the River Huron.
Andrew Griswold Whitney was the 5th and final signer of the Gazette article. Whitney, 32 and still single, was a prominent member of the Detroit Bar and a law partner of Solomon Sibley. What is perhaps Whitney's most enduring legacy is the corporate seal of the city of Detroit, which he designed, commemorating the Great Fire of 1805. The Latin motto, which encircles the seal, translates as, "We hope for better things. Another will rise from the ashes." Today, Lake Whitney is Sylvan Lake.
We crossed the Huron where it issues from Lake Whitney and traced it in all of its windings for 12 miles.
Today we recognize the Huron as the Clinton River. Its watershed drains 760 square miles, including a large portion of Oakland County. Along the 12-mile course, the explorers passed where the Huron River crosses the Saginaw Trail, a spot that would soon become an important new focus. As the end of their adventure approached, we can picture them on a warm autumn day enjoying their 12-mile ride along the river.
The land on both sides of the Huron were generally elevated rolling ridges, and gradually inclining plains, thinly timbered with white and black oak, and here and there a tract of rich bottom, the soil warm and sandy.
Did they dismount their horses to see just how warm and sandy it was? It was not long before they arrived at the first settlement. That settlement was near what we now know as Rochester. Its first settlers had arrived in March of 1817. James Graham, his son Alexander, his son-in-law Christopher Hartsaw, and their wives had ventured by river from Mount Clemens. At the time, it was the only way into the interior until the exploration proved otherwise. Reverend Monteith recounts their visit with the Grahams in his diary.
The company seemed to be well satisfied with their explorations, and Saturday we had finished the tour, which was embraced in our plan. We then had come around to some civilized inhabitants about 30 miles from Detroit, where we rested on the Lord's Day and enjoyed the exercises of divine worship with some of our destitute countrymen.
The explorers concluded their report to the Gazette with a compelling message designed to convince settlers that the land that would be named Oakland County was filled with promise.
On the whole, with respect to the lands over which we traveled, it may be said that a very considerable portion of them are excellent, that most of them are good, and that the poorest section of them might be cultivated with profit. Good water is another important article, and we were able to say that we found it in great abundance. This may be said generally of the waters of the territory. It has been supposed that there were too little stone. This may be the case in some small districts, and there appear to be no rocky cliffs, but there are generally found on the ridgeland a sufficiency of stone. As to seats for mills, there will be no want. One may be found in every neighborhood.
The 5 explorers who wrote to the Gazette signed their names simply D.C. McKintrey, A.E. Wing, B. Stead, J. Monteith, A.G. Whitney. Postscript. On November 5th, just 3 weeks after their return to Detroit, these men, except for Reverend Monteith, joined with several others to organize the Pontiac Company. At the intersection of the Saginaw Trail and the Clinton River, the Pontiac Company purchased 1,280 acres and commissioned the platting of a town, the first in the interior. They set aside land for schools, churches, and cemeteries, while work on mills and forges began immediately. On January 12, 1819, Governor Cass formally named Oakland County the first county in interior of the territory, and Pontiac became the county seat. Initially, there were just 2 townships, Oakland in the north and Bloomfield in the south. Within 2 short years, Austin Wing, with pride and excitement, wrote to his father back in New York.
There is now a bright prospect of the country's settling rapidly.
The expedition had succeeded. They had opened a gateway into the interior, and their report to the Detroit Gazette spread widely. Immigrants from New England and New York began to arrive and settle, and they settled in Oakland County, the brightest prospect of them all.
Come on, you Yankee farmer boys who'd like to change your lot, with spunk enough to travel beyond your native spot and leave behind the village where Pond Mile does stay. Come go with me and settle in Michigan, IA.
This has been a production in partnership with the Greater West Bloomfield Historical Society. For more information on events and presentations on our local history, you can visit gwbhs.org. We thank you for joining us as we took a look into our local history on Civic Center TV, television that's close to home.